He told me girls were inferior to boys while forcing me to scrub his mother's floors. What he didn't know was that I was recording every cruel word, building a case that would destroy his precious reputation forever. I thought I was marrying my soulmate when I said yes to Marcus 18 months ago. The wedding was everything I dreamed of: white roses cascading down marble columns, hundreds of guests celebrating what everyone called a perfect love match, and a man who whispered promises about forever as we exchanged vows under the cathedral's stained glass windows. He held my hand so tenderly during the ceremony, his eyes soft with what I believed was devotion, telling me I was his queen, his everything, the missing piece of his soul. But souls, I learned, can be master actors when they need to be. The first crack in the fairy tale came exactly 12 hours after our wedding night. I woke up expecting gentle kisses and whispered endearments, the kind of morning after intimacy every new bride dreams of. Instead, I found Marcus fully dressed, scrolling through his phone with the detached efficiency of a businessman checking stock prices. "Get up," he said without looking at me. "My mother expects breakfast at 7:30 sharp. She doesn't tolerate lateness." I laughed, thinking it was some kind of newlywed joke. "Can't we just order something? It's our first morning as husband and wife." The look he gave me could have frozen fire. "This isn't a hotel, Emma. This is a family home with responsibilities. My mother has been running this household for 30 years, and you'll learn to follow her rules if you want to fit in." Something cold settled in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. Wedding stress, I told myself. Adjustment period. Every marriage has growing pains. But love, I discovered, requires participation from both parties. The second crack came that very afternoon, when I tried to initiate the intimacy every new marriage is supposed to have. We were alone in our bedroom, and I approached Marcus with the nervous excitement of a woman ready to truly begin her married life. I touched his shoulder gently, leaned in for a kiss, let him know I was ready for whatever came next. He pulled away like I'd burned him. "I'm not in the mood," he said, but his tone carried something darker than simple disinterest. It carried disgust. I said, "It's okay. We can just hold each other, talk, get to know each other better. He knows everything I need to know about you already, and right now, I need space to think." Space. On our second day of marriage, my husband needed space from me? The pattern established itself with brutal efficiency over the following weeks. Every morning brought new rules, new ways I was failing to meet expectations I'd never been told about. The kitchen was Margaret's domain, but I was expected to clean it. The house was their family home, but I was responsible for maintaining it. The social calendar was their decision, but I was blamed when I couldn't keep up with obligations no one had explained to me. Marcus watched it all with the detached interest of someone observing a mildly entertaining television show. When his mother criticized my cooking, he nodded sagely as if her wisdom was beyond dispute. When she complained about my cleaning, he would sigh and tell me I needed to try harder to please her. When I attempted to discuss our relationship, our future, our complete lack of physical intimacy, he would dismiss my concerns with the casual cruelty of someone swatting flies. "Marriage isn't about your feelings, Emma," he told me one evening after I tried to explain how isolated I felt. "It's about duty, responsibility, keeping the family honor intact. If you focused more on your obligations and less on your emotions, you'd be happier." The third crack became a chasm 3 months into our marriage, when I finally found the courage to address the elephant that had taken up permanent residence in our bedroom. We hadn't been intimate even once since our wedding night, which itself had been perfunctory, awkward, and completely devoid of the tenderness I'd expected from the man who claimed to love me. "Marcus," I said one night as we lay in bed like strangers, "I need to talk to you about us, about our marriage. We're not connecting the way I thought we would." He didn't even put down his phone. "What's there to discuss? You have everything you need: food, shelter, a respectable family name. Most women would be grateful. Most women would also expect their husbands to actually want them." That got his attention. He set down his phone and looked at me with something that might have been pity if it had contained any warmth. "Want is a luxury, Emma. Marriage is a practical arrangement. You provide domestic services and family continuity. I provide financial security and social status. Romance is for movies, not real life." I felt something die inside me that night. Not just hope, though that certainly withered, but some essential part of my identity as a woman worth loving. I'd entered this marriage believing I was cherished, desired, valued for who I was. Instead, I discovered I was simply functional, a household appliance with the bonus feature of eventually producing grandchildren. But appliances, apparently, could still be defective. The real cruelty began in month 4, when Marcus started openly expressing his regret about marrying me. Not in private moments of frustration, but in front of his family, friends, anyone who would listen to his litany of complaints about the wife who couldn't seem to do anything right. I should have listened to my instincts, he told his brother during a family barbecue, while I sat 3 feet away. She seemed different during dating, but once the ring was on her finger, her true nature came out. Lazy, emotional, always complaining about something. His brother laughed. At least she's pretty enough. That counts for something. Pretty doesn't make up for incompetence, Marcus replied, flipping burgers with unnecessary force. A man needs a wife who understands her place, not one who constantly questions everything and creates drama over nothing. I excused myself to the bathroom and cried until my eyes were swollen, then returned to the patio and smiled through dessert like nothing had happened. Because that's what good wives did, according to Margaret's daily lectures. They absorbed insults with grace and never embarrassed their husbands with emotional outbursts. The systematic destruction of my self-worth became Marcus's favorite hobby. He criticized everything, the way I walked, talked, dressed, cooked, cleaned, even breathed. According to him, I was too loud, too quiet, too emotional, too cold, too eager to please, too stubborn when I didn't immediately comply with his every demand. Girls from your background just aren't raised properly, he explained to his mother one afternoon while I folded laundry nearby. They're spoiled, given too much freedom, told they're equal to boys instead of learning their proper role. It takes time to train them properly. Train them, like I was a dog who needed to learn tricks. The physical neglect was almost easier to bear than the psychological warfare. At least when Marcus ignored my existence, I wasn't being actively torn down. But he seemed to take genuine pleasure in finding new ways to diminish me, new methods of making sure I understood exactly how disappointed he was in the life partner he'd been stuck with. My buddies' wives don't question their husbands' decisions, he told me after I suggested we might discuss major purchases together. They trust their husband's judgment because they understand that men are better at logical thinking. Women are too emotional to make good choices. That's not true, I said quietly. Women are perfectly capable of logical thinking. His laugh was bitter and sharp. Look at yourself, Emma. You're getting emotional right now just because I stated a simple fact. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't separate your feelings from reality. By month 8, I was a shell of the confident woman who'd walked down that flower-strewn aisle. I questioned every thought, second-guessed every action, apologized for existing in spaces that belonged to his family. I stopped calling my friends because I couldn't bear to lie about how happy I was, and I couldn't face the truth about how thoroughly I'd been broken down. Marcus had achieved his goal. I was the perfectly compliant wife who asked permission to breathe. But compliance, I discovered, wasn't enough for him. He needed active degradation, constant proof of his superiority, regular confirmation that I understood my place in the hierarchy of human worth. And that place, according to his increasingly frequent lectures, was somewhere below farm animals but slightly above insects. The problem with modern girls, he announced during a family gathering where his male relatives nodded along like he was delivering profound wisdom, is that they think they deserve respect just for existing. They don't understand that respect is earned through service, through knowing your role and fulfilling it without complaint. His cousin raised his beer in salute. Exactly right, women today are too influenced by feminist ideas about equality. They forget that families work best when everyone knows their place. Girls are naturally inferior in logical thinking, Marcus continued, warming to his favorite theme. That's not sexism, it's biology. They're designed for domestic work and child-rearing, not decision-making or leadership. The sooner they accept that, the happier everyone will be. I sat in the corner, invisible and insignificant, listening to my husband explain to a room full of men why I was inherently less valuable than they were. And the most devastating part wasn't just that he believed it, it was that he was slowly making me believe it too. But rock bottom, I learned, still had a basement. The breaking point came in month 10 when I finally worked up the courage to mention divorce, not as a threat or manipulation tactic, but as a desperate plea for either change or freedom. I couldn't continue living as a domestic servant in an emotional wasteland, married to a man who seemed to despise my very existence. I can't do this anymore, Marcus, I said one night after his mother had spent 20 minutes berating me for forgetting to iron his father's work shirts. I'm miserable, you're miserable, maybe we made a mistake. The transformation in his face was terrifying. Gone was the cold indifference I'd grown accustomed to, replaced by something hot and dangerous. Don't you ever mention divorce again, he hissed, his voice low and deadly. Do you understand me? Never. But we're both unhappy. I don't care about happy. I care about my reputation, my family's honor, my standing in the community, and I will not be known as the man whose wife left him because he was weak enough to let her leave. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a discussion about our relationship. It was a declaration of ownership. I belonged to him now, legally and socially, and he would never allow me to escape in a way that might reflect poorly on his image as the dominant partner in our marriage. People will blame you if we divorce, I said desperately. They'll say you couldn't keep your wife happy.
His smile was cold enough to freeze blood. No, Emma, they'll blame you. Because I'll make sure they know exactly what kind of wife you were, how ungrateful, how demanding, how impossible to please. By the time I'm finished telling our story, everyone will think I was a saint for putting up with you as long as I did. That night, lying in bed next to a man who just threatened to destroy my reputation if I tried to escape him, I realized I was trapped in a prison disguised as a marriage. The golden cage was still a cage, and my warden had made it clear that he would rather destroy me than let me go. But prisons, even golden ones, sometimes have weak spots if you know where to look. The plan began forming slowly, carefully, like a photograph developing in a dark room. If Marcus valued his reputation above all else, if his greatest fear was being seen as weak or unsuccessful, then that's where he was most vulnerable. He'd spent months systematically destroying my sense of self-worth, but in doing so, he'd revealed exactly what mattered most to him: the opinion of others. I started small. Every time he launched into one of his lectures about women's inferiority, every time he criticized me in front of others, every time he made cruel comments about my worth or intelligence, I began documenting it. My phone, hidden in my purse or placed strategically around the house, captured hours of audio evidence of his systematic emotional abuse. "Girls like you think you're entitled to respect." His voice came through crystal clear on one recording. "But respect is for people who contribute something valuable to society. What do you contribute, Emma? What value do you add to anyone's life?" The recordings were devastating, not just because of their cruelty, but because of how calculated that cruelty was. Marcus wasn't losing his temper or speaking from emotional pain. He was methodically, deliberately destroying my psyche with the precision of a surgeon. But more importantly, the recordings revealed a man whose behavior would horrify the community that respected him so much. I began reaching out to old contacts carefully, subtly. Friends from college who worked in law, journalism, social work. I framed it as academic curiosity about women's rights, domestic abuse awareness, legal protections for wives in difficult marriages. I learned about documentation requirements, evidence standards, legal precedents for proving emotional abuse. Most importantly, I learned about the power of public opinion in a community like ours, where reputation was everything and social standing could be destroyed overnight by the right kind of scandal. While I gathered evidence, I also began quietly reclaiming pieces of myself. I started exercising in secret, rebuilding physical strength that months of psychological warfare had sapped away. I reconnected with my own interests, reading books Marcus had dismissed as useless women's nonsense, writing in journals I kept hidden like contraband. I opened a bank account in my name only, slowly accumulating money from the household budget he'd never bothered to monitor closely because financial management was woman's work beneath his attention. I researched apartments, legal aid services, support groups for women leaving abusive marriages. But most importantly, I documented everything: the way he spoke to me, the impossible standards he set, the deliberate humiliation in front of others, the threats he'd made about divorce. I created a comprehensive record of a man whose private behavior was the complete opposite of his public image as a respectful, successful husband. The final piece of evidence came during a family gathering where Marcus had been drinking and felt particularly inspired to share his wisdom about marriage with his younger male cousins who were about to get married themselves. "The key to a successful marriage," he announced, his voice slightly slurred but his conviction absolute, "is making sure your wife understands from day one that you're in charge. Women test boundaries constantly, it's in their nature, but if you establish dominance early and maintain it consistently, they'll eventually stop fighting and accept their proper role." "What if she threatens divorce?" asked his youngest cousin, barely 22 and nervously engaged to a girl from their college. Marcus's laugh was ugly and triumphant. "Then you make it clear that divorce will destroy her more than it destroys you. Women are emotional creatures. They can't handle social isolation or public shame the way men can. Threaten to ruin her reputation, turn her family against her, make sure everyone knows she was the problem. She'll back down every time." "And what if she doesn't?" "Then you follow through. Better to be a divorced man who stood up for himself than a weak husband who let his wife walk all over him. Either way, you maintain your dignity and your standing in the community." I had it all on recording: his philosophy, his methods, his threats, his complete lack of remorse for the systematic destruction of his wife's mental health. Everything I needed to show the world exactly what kind of man commanded so much respect in our social circle. The execution of my plan was deliberately slow and thorough. I didn't want to simply escape. I wanted Marcus to face the consequences of his choices the same way he'd forced me to face the consequences of mine. I started by sharing selected recordings with a few key women in our community, not as gossip or revenge, but as concerns about a friend's marriage that I thought they should be aware of. These women, respected community leaders whose opinions carried significant weight, were horrified by what they heard. "This is not how a good husband speaks to his wife," Mrs. Patterson from the church committee told me after listening to just 5 minutes of Marcus's greatest hits. "This is cruelty disguised as traditional values. No woman should endure this kind of treatment." Within weeks, whispers began circulating through our social network. Questions about Marcus's character, concerns about his treatment of his wife, doubts about whether his success in business translated to success as a husband. The very reputation he'd weaponized against me began working in my favor. Meanwhile, I filed for legal separation with documentation that made my case undeniable. Hours of audio evidence, detailed journals of emotional abuse, medical records showing stress-related health problems, witness statements from neighbors who'd heard his verbal assaults through thin walls. When Marcus received the papers, his reaction was exactly what I'd expected: rage, threats, promises to destroy me socially and financially. But his threats no longer carried power because I'd already shared the truth with people who mattered. "You'll regret this," he snarled during our final conversation in front of my lawyer. "Please do tell everyone, Marcus. I'd love for them to hear your version of traditional values. Shall I play some examples of those values in action?" His face went white as he realized the scope of what I documented. Every cruel word, every deliberate humiliation, every threat he'd made when he thought I was too broken to fight back, all of it preserved with digital clarity. The divorce proceedings were swift and decisive. Faced with evidence that would destroy him professionally and socially if made public, Marcus agreed to every term I requested. No alimony, I didn't want his money. No ongoing contact, I wanted him completely out of my life. Just my freedom and a legal declaration that his version of marriage was actually legally recognized as abuse. The most satisfying moment came 6 months later when I ran into him at a wedding where we both knew the family. The confident, domineering man who'd spent 18 months systematically destroying my self-worth looked diminished, uncertain, awkward in social situations where whispered conversations stopped when he approached. He tried to approach me during the ceremony, perhaps hoping to intimidate me one final time, but I simply turned on my phone's recording app and smiled at him. "Please," I said loud enough for nearby relatives to hear, "share your thoughts about marriage with everyone here. I'm sure they'd love to hear your expertise on how husbands should treat their wives." He walked away without another word. The church ladies who'd heard my evidence made sure his behavior became common knowledge throughout our community. His business suffered as clients questioned his character. His family relationships strained as people realized what kind of man they'd been defending. His dating life became non-existent as word spread about how he treated the woman who'd loved him most. But more importantly, I discovered something Marcus had tried to destroy: my own strength. Every recording I'd made, every piece of evidence I'd gathered, every strategic move I'd planned had been an act of rebellion against his attempts to make me helpless. I started attending therapy to undo the psychological damage he'd inflicted. I reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. I went back to school to finish the degree I'd abandoned when Marcus convinced me education was wasted on women who should focus on domestic duties. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I ran into his cousin Brian at the grocery store, the same one who'd toasted Marcus's philosophy about keeping women in their place. He looked embarrassed, shuffling his feet as he recognized me. "Emma," he said awkwardly, "I heard about what happened. I wanted you to know that if I'd understood what was really going on, I never would have... those things Marcus said that night?" "You mean the night he explained how to psychologically break your wife into submission?" I asked calmly. "The night you all laughed and agreed with his methods?" Brian's face went red. "We didn't know he was serious. We thought it was just guys talking, blowing off steam." "No, Brian. You thought abuse was funny as long as it wasn't happening to someone you cared about. You thought cruelty was acceptable as long as it maintained the social order you benefited from." I walked away, leaving him standing in the cereal aisle with the weight of his complicity, because that was another thing I'd learned. Bystanders who enable abuse are just as responsible as the abusers themselves. Today, 2 years after my escape, I work as a victim advocate, helping other women document abuse and navigate the legal system. I speak at community centers and churches about recognizing the signs of emotional abuse, about the difference between traditional values and systematic cruelty. Marcus still lives in our hometown, but his reputation never recovered. His business failed, his family relationships remain strained, and his attempts at dating inevitably end when women learn about his history. He tried to rebuild his image by joining community organizations and volunteering at local charities, but the recordings I'd shared had done their work too thoroughly. The last I heard, he'd moved to another state, claiming he needed a fresh start away from vindictive people who wouldn't let him move on. But the internet is forever, and character references travel faster than moving trucks. I kept copies of everything, not for revenge, but as insurance. Because men like Marcus don't change, they just find new victims. And if he ever tries to harm another woman the way he harmed me, the evidence of who he really is will be waiting. Betrayal always demands payment, but the currency isn't always what the betrayer expects. Marcus thought he could destroy me with impunity, that his reputation would protect him while mine crumbled. Instead, I used his own cruelty as the weapon that freed me from his control. Sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate schemes, it's simply refusing to protect someone from the consequences of their own actions. The dignity he tried to steal from me, I took it back with interest, along with something he'll never recover: his precious reputation built on the suffering of the woman who trusted him most. Subscribe for more stories of survival, strength, and the courage to fight back.